For joining us. If we look at the Arms Deal Commission and the Marikana Commission, there's a stark difference in that with the Arms Deal Commission there was a pool of lawyers that they said, here's the pool of lawyers, you can choose from here and we're going to foot the bill. With Marikana though, legal aid said we can't handle this, there's no framework to deal with it, and you almost feel as though the miners have a right to feel aggrieved.
I think the miners certainly have a right to feel aggrieved, and there is that distinction between these two commissions. The Marikana Commission, in the beginning there was no funding made available whatsoever to any of the victims. My organization, SERI, represents the families of 34 people killed on the 16th of August as well as AMCU, and we had to appeal to the Legal Aid Board to make an exception, which they did in our case. However, the Legal Aid Board did not make that exception in the case of Advocate Mpofu's team representing the injured miners, and the result is where we are today, with the Constitutional Court having decided yesterday that there was to be no interim funding from the government, or they were not going to order that.
What are the implications of that judgment if you take into consideration the prospect of equal justice for all?
I think it's quite considerable. I think when you take the Marikana Commission of Inquiry into consideration, it is one of the most serious commissions of inquiry that we've had since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, if not the most serious commission of inquiry. It deals with fundamental issues. It's a very, very unique and problematic situation in a democracy to have 34 people killed by the police in cold blood, and this is an extremely important moment in South African history. I think it's too fine a point cannot be put on how critical it is to get this right, how critical the Commission is for raising systemic issues about policing, about the way that public order policing in particular is carried out, whether or not police have adequate training, command and control, all of these issues. These are all the systemic issues apart from the living conditions and the conditions under which miners toil and live. These are all the systemic issues which affect people in the entire country, and I think it's critical that the Commission goes ahead and that it is appropriately resourced, and specifically that the victims have proper legal representation. Now, in the case of most of the victims, they are obviously relying on they don't have the funds for this, so they're relying on outside assistance for that legal representation.
As you're talking us through this, I'm actually thinking of an example where you have an individual in a criminal case, for example, someone that's involved in some sort of criminality, they get arrested, they appear in court, they're entitled to legal aid. But yet we have this commission which would speak to a bigger problem, a societal issue, and you would think you would have more at stake there. And we're sitting in this situation where legal aid is not available. The miners and their families are in this situation. Why are we in this situation?
We're in this situation for a number of reasons. The first is that according to the Legal Aid Board Act, the LASA Act, as well as its rules, they do not fund commissions of inquiry. So they made an exception in respect of some of the parties before Marikana, but they feel they do not have the funds precisely because their rules say they should not cover commissions. They don't have the funds to cover commissions. So there is a question there as to whether that section of the Act and the rules and practice should be challenged, and that's certainly something that the Constitutional Court in its judgment yesterday did point to. That remains an opening if one wanted to challenge that. The other reason I would say that we're in this situation is that we do not have an interpretation of a right to legal representation at state expense in civil matters. Now, what the Constitutional Court pointed to in its judgment, although it didn't want to pronounce on the final hearing in the lower court, it made the point that this is not a criminal forum. It's not a trial. And as you were pointing out, yes, there is a right to legal representation at state expense for accused persons in a trial if substantial injustice would otherwise result. The way that we've always interpreted that is that if a prison sentence is hanging over that case, what the court would say is that this is not a trial. However, I think what you're alluding to is very important, that this commission has fundamental implications for future actions, including criminal trials. For example, the fact that these injured minors still have hanging over them common purpose murder charges, which the state brought against them and temporarily withdrew. In other words, at some point they may be reinstituted. And the question then is, if this commission is busy laying the groundwork for future criminal actions, then shouldn't all the parties, including particularly the people who were accused of common purpose murder, have legal representation at state expense?
Thank you very much for your time and insight. That was senior researcher Jackie Dugard from the Socio-Economic Rights Institute.